the human mind has a remarkable ability to hide things, not just from other people, from itself, to section off what it's capable of, to function completely normally in the light while something else entirely operates in the dark. Today's case is about that ability taken to its furthest possible point. Let's get into it.
There is a photograph of Sean Vincent Gillis, taken sometime in the early 2000s. He's smiling, soft face, glasses, the kind of forgettable middle-aged man you'd pass in a grocery store without a second glance. He looks like someone's quiet uncle, someone who fixes things around the house, someone who remembers birthdays. He was not that man. For 10 years, while the city of Baton Rouge, Louisiana, went about its daily life, Sean Vincent Gillis was driving these same streets after dark, hunting, and what he did to the women he found is so deeply disturbing that even seasoned investigators who worked his case struggled to describe it on camera years later. This is the story of the man they called the other Baton Rouge killer, and by the time this is over, you'll understand exactly why that name carries such a cold, specific weight. Sean was born on June 24, 1962, in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. His father, Norman Gillis, was an alcoholic with serious untreated mental illness, and the marriage was unstable from the start. But what happened in Sean's earliest days would become one of the most disturbing footnotes in his entire case file. At some point, before abandoning the family entirely, Norman held a loaded gun to baby Sean's head. Whatever was running through that man's mind, he didn't pull the trigger, he just left. Sean was barely a year old. Yvonne Gillis raised her son alone with help from her parents. By most accounts, Sean had a relatively quiet childhood. He was smart, he went to college and earned a degree. He wasn't visibly troubled in any way that made the people around him worry. He was just there. Mild-mannered, unremarkable, the kind of person who doesn't leave much of an impression, drifting through southern Louisiana, drawing no attention and raising no flags. But something was building underneath that surface. In his teenage years, he picked up minor charges, traffic violations, a DUI, marijuana possession. Nothing that pointed toward what was coming, just small cracks, the kind that in hindsight looked like pressure looking for a way out. By his early 30s, Gillis was unemployed and largely purposeless, living with his long-term partner, Terry Lemoyne, a woman who by all accounts loved him genuinely and completely. She later described him as devoted, gentle, a good companion. She knew he watched violent pornography. She found it troubling. At some point, he had even shown her photographs of dead women, and she remembered being disturbed by it. But she had no idea, not the faintest shadow of a suspicion, about what else Sean Vincent Gillis was doing in the hours she wasn't watching. On the night of March 21st, 1994, Gillis walked into a retirement home in Baton Rouge. The front door had been left unlocked by a resident for a visiting nurse. He was not the nurse. He moved through the corridors until he reached the room of Anne Bryan. She was 81 years old. His intention was to assault her, but when he touched her, she screamed, and so he silenced her. He cut her throat and stabbed her over 50 times. Then he walked back out into the Louisiana night and drove home to Terry. Anne Bryan became the first known victim of a man who would not be caught for another 10 years. Here is something that takes a moment to fully land. After that night in 1994, Sean Gillis did not kill again for almost 5 years. He went back to his quiet life. He watched the news. He drove his car through Baton Rouge. He was a good boyfriend, and whatever was living inside him went completely still, patient, coiled, biding its time the way something genuinely dangerous knows how to do. January 4th, 1999, 5 years after Anne Bryan, Gillis went out into the night and found Catherine Hall on the streets. She was 29 years old. He pulled up, told her what he wanted, offered her money. She got in the car. The moment that door closed, the night changed completely. Somewhere in the dark of that car, Gillis looped a plastic zip tie around Catherine's neck and pulled it tight. But Catherine Hall fought. She clawed and thrashed and tried to force the door open. And in that struggle, something in Gillis switched. He pulled a knife and stabbed her 16 times. When it was finally over, he sat in the silence with her body and did what he would come to do every single time after this. He took his time. He undressed her. He mutilated her. He removed her eyelids. When investigators later asked him about Catherine Hall specifically, his answer was recorded on video. He looked at the camera and said, plainly, without flinching, "I wanted to see what her butt looked like, sliced open, honestly." Then he drove to a remote construction site on the edge of the city and arranged her body beneath a street sign that read, "Dead End." He later admitted that was deliberate. That was his sense of humor. When officers found her the next morning, naked, posed, mutilated, positioned beneath that sign, an investigator on the scene said it was immediately clear they were not looking at a single crime. They were looking at someone who had done this before, someone who had practiced, someone who would absolutely do it again. They were right on both counts. 4 months later, in May 1999, Gillis was driving through a quiet residential street in the more affluent south of Baton Rouge when he noticed a woman running. Her name was Hardy Schmidt. She was 52 years old, married with 3 children, living a comfortable life in a neighborhood that bore no resemblance to the world Catherine Hall had inhabited. That didn't matter to Gillis. None of that information registered as relevant. He began watching her. For 3 weeks, he drove that same route at different hours, mapping her routine, learning what time she left the house, which road she took, where she turned around. 3 weeks of a man sitting in a parked car, engine running, watching a woman who had absolutely no idea she had been chosen. No idea at all that somewhere out there, a quiet, unremarkable man in glasses had decided that her life was going to end. On the morning of May 30th, just after 5:30, Hardy Schmidt stepped out into the early Louisiana heat and started her run. Gillis was already there. He aimed his car directly at her. The impact knocked her clean off the road into a roadside ditch. He stopped, got out, crouched down, wound heavy-duty wire around her neck and forced her into the vehicle. He drove. He assaulted her. Then he continued driving. Unhurried, no panic, nobody watching, and disposed of her body in a bayou off Highway 61. 2 days later, her family reported her missing. Her body was found in the water. Gillis drove home. He and Terry had dinner. By November of 1999, the thing inside him had stopped pretending it could wait. He killed Joyce Williams on the 12th. She was 36 years old, and this time, he brought her body back to the house he shared with Terry, timed carefully for when Terry was at work. The room's quiet, hours before anyone would come home. He spent time there with Joyce Williams in that house before eventually moving her body somewhere it would be found. Joyce Williams had a daughter. That daughter later stood outside a courthouse and spoke about what had been done to her mother after death, the specific cuts, the particular places he had carved. She said, who would want to cut a dead body? She suffered enough. 6 weeks later, in January 2000, Lillian Robinson was gone. She was 52. Same method, zip tie, the same terrible patience, the same ritual that Gillis had now fully settled into. He brought her back to the house again. He stayed as long as he could. Then he drove her to the edges of the parish and left her near the water. A fisherman found what remained of her weeks later, and the world barely blinked. There are things Gillis said about these women in interviews that are genuinely difficult to process. He told investigators that the women who trusted him enough to get into his car loved him. That word, loved, because he treated them like ladies before he killed them. And the truly unsettling part is that he seemed to believe it completely. October 2000, Gillis drove an hour from Baton Rouge to the town of New Iberia to visit his goddaughter. He played the role, warm, reliable, the trusted godfather, and spent time in that family home with the child he had been entrusted to care for. Then, on the drive back, he found Marilyn Nevels. She was 38 years old, living transient at the margins of everything. He killed her and left her on a levee south of Baton Rouge. Nobody reported Marilyn Nevels missing. Nobody filed a report. Nobody noticed she was gone. Her decomposed remains were found 15 days later by a man walking his dog, and even then she went unidentified for years, until Gillis told police himself. She was someone's daughter. She was 38 years old, and the world moved on without her like she had never existed. After that, another long silence. 3 full years. Terry coming home each night to the man she loved. The two of them cooking meals, watching television, living the unremarkable domestic life that had always been their cover story. Gillis reading the papers, watching the news, moving through the city like something that had learned to look exactly like everything around it. And then, in October 2003, the stillness broke again. Johnny May Williams was 45 years old, and this one was different in a way that stopped investigators cold when they eventually learned of it. Gillis had known her personally. She wasn't a stranger in a car or a woman he'd spotted from a distance. She was someone connected to his actual life, someone he had known for 8 years. He killed her anyway, with the same quiet efficiency he had refined over nearly a decade. And then after she was dead, he severed both her hands. He staged her body carefully and left her to be found. And then, on February 26, 2004, he killed for the last time. Donna Bennett Johnston was 43 years old. She had children. She had fallen into addiction and into street work. And on that February night, she was in the wrong place at the exact wrong moment. Gillis strangled her with a zip tie. What he did to her body afterward went further than anything he had allowed himself before, as though 10 years of escalation had finally arrived somewhere with no ceiling left. He removed her left arm. He mutilated her extensively. According to his own confession to investigators, though not independently corroborated by physical evidence, he consumed part of her. Then he took 45 photographs, different angles, different positions, the methodical documentation of someone who intended to revisit this. He posed her with the same cold deliberateness he had brought to every crime scene before this one. Drove to a drainage canal near Ben-Hur Road on the south edge of Baton Rouge and left her there in the February dark. He had no idea he had just made the only mistake that would ever matter. Because in the soft Louisiana mud beside Donna Johnston's body, his tires had left a perfect impression. Now here is where this story takes a turn that reframes everything you've just heard, because Sean Gillis had not been operating in isolation, not in the way you'd think. Another man had been doing the same thing, but loudly enough to consume every available investigative resource in the entire state. His name was Derek Todd Lee. Between 1999 and 2003, Lee murdered at least 7 women across the Baton Rouge area. He was prolific, reckless, and terrifying. He became front-page news, the subject of a massive multi-agency task force, the source of genuine widespread panic across Louisiana, which meant that in the enormous shadow cast by Derek Todd Lee, Sean Vincent Gillis was almost entirely invisible. He knew it. When police searched Gillis's home after his arrest, they found newspaper clippings about Derek Todd Lee's murders. They found a folder on his computer hard drive labeled simply DTL, Lee's initials, packed with saved news articles and case updates that Gillis had been collecting for years. He had been following every development, monitoring the investigation, watching how police responded to each discovery and adjusting accordingly. And in his FBI interview after his arrest, he said something that revealed exactly what kind of mind investigators had been up against all along. He told them he had been playing chess with them, that after every crime he watched the news to judge whether he was winning. "I was the chess master," he said. "You're not going to beat me." 2 serial killers, 1 city, one hiding in the shadow of the other and keeping score. Derek Todd Lee was arrested in May 2003. Baton Rouge exhaled. The city was told the nightmare was over. And in the months that followed, investigators began looking carefully at the cases that didn't fit Lee's profile, cases that had been quietly accumulating in the background, attributable to someone else entirely, a different signature. different hands. The task force began to see the shape of it, and then Donna Johnston's tire track cracked the whole thing open. The State Police Crime Lab analyzed the impression in the mud and identified the exact make, model, and type of tire. Then came the detail that made the list of suspects suddenly remarkably small. This particular tire had only been manufactured during a 3-year window ending in 2003. In the entire Baton Rouge area, it had been sold to just 90 people. 90. Investigators built the list and began working through it methodically, door by door, DNA swab by DNA swab. Sean Vincent Gillis was the 26th name they reached. On April 28, 2004, they knocked on his door. He agreed to be interviewed. He agreed to give a swab. He was cooperative, quiet, entirely unremarkable, just as Terry had always described him. The DNA results came back the following morning. His sample matched Donna Johnston. It matched Catherine Hall. It matched Johnny May Williams. On April 29th, a SWAT team arrived at the house Sean Gillis shared with Terry Lemoyne. She was standing there when they took him. As they walked him out in handcuffs, he turned back to look at her. He apologized. Just that. A quiet apology to the woman who had spent 10 years sleeping beside a killer and never once known what she was sleeping beside. Inside the house, investigators found what Gillis had been accumulating across a decade: trophies, body parts he had kept, jewelry taken from victims, dozens of photographs, some of which were later entered into evidence at trial. At the station, they sat him down, and Sean Vincent Gillis talked. He didn't ask for a lawyer and go quiet. He didn't construct a story or deflect. He confessed. Sometimes during that confession, he laughed. Other times, something that looked like genuine remorse crossed his face and settled there for a moment before disappearing. "I'm sorry I hurt people," he said. And then, when asked to describe how he thought about his victims in those final moments before he killed them, he answered without hesitation. It was like they were already dead to me before he touched them, before he chose them. Already objects, already gone, already his. Sean Vincent Gillis was convicted of multiple counts of first-degree murder. The jury deadlocked on the death penalty. He was sentenced to life without the possibility of parole and transferred to Louisiana State Penitentiary, known as Angola, one of the most restrictive prison environments in the United States. He is 63 years old, and he is still there. Derek Todd Lee, the man whose infamy gave Gillis the cover he needed, whose shadow he hid inside for years, died in that same prison system in 2016 from a brain tumor. When Gillis was arrested, investigators had connected him to 3 murders. 3. He was the one who told them about the other 5. He volunteered every name, every location, every woman he had taken, walked them through it without being asked. Some people read that as remorse, as a man finally unloading 10 years of weight he could no longer carry. But the FBI agents who sat across from him in that room described something else entirely. A man who seemed, at certain moments, almost proud. The chess master, that's what he called himself. And for 10 years, 10 years of 8 women, 10 years of coming home to Terry, 10 years of driving those same streets that everyone else drove. He was right. On the night of August 29, 1997, 2 college students walked hand in hand along a set of railroad tracks in Lexington, Kentucky. It was a warm summer evening. They were young, happy, heading back to a party. They had no reason to be afraid. They never made it. Something was already waiting for them in the dark, crouched silently behind a metal electrical box beside the tracks, small, still, watching. It had ridden in on a freight train, the way it always did, and now it had found them. What happened next would eventually unravel one of the most disturbing and embarrassing failures in American law enforcement history, because the man hiding behind that box had been arrested over 30 times. He had been deported 8 times in the span of 18 months alone. He was known to authorities. He was in their systems. And still, he kept coming back. His name was Angel Maturino Resendiz, and before it was all over, he would be linked to at least 15 murders across 6 states, though investigators suspected the true number could be as high as 23. Many of those cases will never be officially closed. This is his story. Angel Maturino Reséndiz was born on August 1st, 1959, in a small city called Izúcar de Matamoros, deep in the state of Puebla, Mexico. He was not born Angel Maturino Reséndiz. He was born Angel Leoncio Reyes Reséndiz. The name he would become infamous under was one he adopted later, borrowed from the people who shaped him and the darkness they left inside him. His mother, Virginia, was a single woman who had never married his father. She raised him alone, and by most accounts, she raised him badly. She beat him. The home was chaotic, unstable. When Angel was 6 years old, Virginia sent him away. She sent him to live with relatives, an uncle. What happened in that house is hard to sit with. According to those who later investigated his background, the uncle sexually abused him, and it didn't stop there. Other men in the town, predators who circulated among the most vulnerable children, also assaulted him. He was 6 years old, 7, 8. There was no one to tell, no one to stop it. By the time Angel was 11, he had run away from home entirely. He lived on the streets of Puebla, a child alone in a city that didn't care about him. He began sniffing glue to dull something he had no language for yet. He stole to eat. He wandered. His family, by their own later admission, barely knew him. Relatives described a loner who barely spoke, who would disappear for months and then reappear, mumbling strange things about God and the end of the world. Even as a teenager, that religious obsession was already coiling around something broken inside him. He had a 7th grade education. He had nothing. And then, at 16, he discovered the border. He crossed into Texas for the first time in 1976. The US Border Patrol caught him at Brownsville and sent him back. He came back again and again, caught twice more before the year was out, sent home each time, and each time he simply waited a few days and tried again. Being rejected from the United States only made him hungrier to return. He had found his rhythm: cross the border, get caught, go back, cross again. At some point, he also discovered freight trains. Here is something worth understanding. The American freight rail network is enormous. Over 140,000 miles of track weaving through every corner of the country, including thousands of miles of rural lines that pass through small towns, alongside isolated houses, behind quiet neighborhoods where people sleep without locking their back doors. For a man with no money, no fixed address, no identity that any agency could reliably track, the trains were a gift. He could be in Texas one night and Kentucky 3 days later. He could be a ghost. In 1979, now 20 years old and living in Florida under one of his many aliases, Reséndiz broke into a home in Miami. The house belonged to an 88-year-old man. The elderly man confronted him. Reséndiz beat him so savagely the man nearly died, then stole his car. No hesitation, no remorse, just a violence that came from somewhere enormous and unnamed inside him. He was convicted, sentenced to 20 years. The prison door closed. But here is the thing about Angel Reséndiz and consequences. They never seem to stick. He served just 5 years before being released and deported back to Mexico. And according to his own mother, something had happened to him inside that prison. She told reporters that he had been gang raped while incarcerated. So now, to everything that had already been done to him, another layer of violation was added. He emerged from prison a man who had been broken open repeatedly and given nothing to fill the cracks with except rage. He came straight back across the border. In 1986, on a flat stretch of land in Bexar County, Texas, investigators found the body of an unidentified homeless woman. She had been shot 4 times with a .38 caliber pistol and dumped in an abandoned farmhouse. Her male companion was also found dead. Reséndiz would later admit to both killings. His reason for the woman, he said, was that she had insulted him. That was it. An insult. 4 bullets. He was arrested again shortly after, this time for entering the country on false documents. More charges followed over the years: weapons possession, fraud. Each time the sentence ran out, he was deported. Each time he came back, border agents processed him through their fingerprint systems, flagged him, sent him home. And within days or weeks, he was already hopping a freight car heading north. The system was a revolving door, and he had figured out how to spin it. Through the late 1980s and into the 1990s, he drifted. He worked seasonal farm labor in Kentucky tobacco fields and Florida orange groves, following the harvests on freight trains. He sent money home to his wife Julieta and their daughter in Durango, Mexico. He used so many aliases that even he seemed to lose track of who he was. The name that appeared most often on his rap sheet was Rafael Resendez Ramirez. For years, that would be the name law enforcement chased. And then, in 1997, something shifted. In March of that year, near railroad tracks in Ocala, Florida, a 19-year-old named Jesse Howell was found bludgeoned to death. He had been beaten with an air hose coupling and left beside the tracks like debris. Jesse and his 16-year-old fiancée, Wendy von Huben, had been teenage runaways from Illinois, adrift and invisible in the way that only homeless young people can be. Wendy was not found at the scene. Her remains would not be discovered until after Resendez's arrest, buried in a shallow grave 30 miles away. He had raped her, strangled her, and then violated her body again after she was dead. Investigators in Florida were looking for a suspect, but they didn't know yet what they were dealing with. 5 months later, on August 29, 1997, Christopher Meyer and Holly Dunn were walking along railroad tracks near the University of Kentucky campus. Christopher was 21 years old. Holly was 20. They were students. It was a warm night and they wanted to be alone. Resendez had already been in that area. He had watched. He had waited. He emerged from behind the electrical box and was on them before they could process what was happening. He used Holly's own belt to tie her hands behind her back. He bound and gagged Christopher, and then he walked away into the dark for a few minutes, as if deciding something. When he came back, he was carrying a large rock. He brought it down on Christopher Meyer's skull. He beat him until Christopher was gone. Then he turned to Holly. What Holly Dunn endured that night, and what she survived, is almost impossible to articulate. He broke her eye socket. He broke her jaw. He hit her across the face with something. She later said it felt like a board, and then struck her in the back of the head 5 or 6 times while she lay on the ground. She was raped. She was left for dead in a ditch beside the tracks, barely conscious, one sandal gone. When she came to, she didn't know if he was still nearby. She didn't know if he was watching. She pulled herself up anyway. She walked barefoot over loose railroad gravel and broken glass in the dark, bleeding, alone, until she reached a light and a door and knocked until someone answered. She spent 5 days in hospital before she was well enough to go home. She later said she remembered Resendez looking at her and saying quietly how easily he could kill her. She survived anyway. In October 1998, in the small town of Hughes Springs, Texas, an 87-year-old woman named Leafy Mason was found dead inside her home. Her front door faced the railroad tracks just 50 yards away. Resendez had come through a window in the night. He had found an antique flat iron inside the house and beaten her to death with it. Leafy Mason had lived in that house for years. She had never had a reason to be afraid of the trains. 2 months later, the killings moved to Georgia. An 81-year-old woman named Fanny Byers was found bludgeoned to death inside her home in Carl, Georgia. The house sat close to a rail line. The pattern was unmistakable to anyone looking, but the investigations were scattered across different states, different jurisdictions, different databases. Nobody had yet put the full picture together. A week after the Georgia killing, Resendez was back in Texas. Dr. Claudia Benton was 39 years old. She was a physician and researcher At Baylor College of Medicine, a wife, a mother. She came home that evening and nothing looked wrong. Resendiz had come in through a window after midnight, and he had waited. The crime scene that homicide detectives walked into the next morning was described by seasoned investigators as among the most disturbing they had ever seen. She had been raped, she had been stabbed, and then she had been beaten to death with a heavy decorative statue taken from somewhere inside her own home. Struck 19 times, that detail, the weapon found inside the victim's house, kept appearing in every one of his crimes. Resendiz carried almost nothing. He arrived with his hands and his eyes and his willingness to use whatever was closest. A rock, a sledgehammer left in a tool room, an antique iron hanging on a wall. He turned the ordinary objects of people's lives into the instruments of their deaths. When police traced Claudia Benton's stolen Jeep to San Antonio, they found fingerprints on the steering column. Those prints came back to a name, Rafael Resendiz Ramirez. 3 weeks later, a judge signed a warrant for burglary, not for murder. There was, the judge said, not yet enough evidence for the murder charge. The warrant was for burglary. On May 2nd, 1999, in Weimar, Texas, Reverend Norman Cernick and his wife Karen were sleeping in the parsonage of the United Church of Christ, directly beside the town's railroad tracks. Resendiz broke in, found a sledgehammer in the tool room, and killed them both in their bed. He also sexually assaulted Karen, a pastor, and his wife, murdered while they slept in the house of God. On June 4th, 1999, a single day that stands apart even in a story full of horrors, Resendiz killed twice. That morning, he broke into the Houston apartment of Nomi Dominguez, a 26-year-old school teacher who lived near the rail lines. He had a pickaxe. He beat her to death with it and stole her car. Then he drove that same car, with the same pickaxe still inside it, 90 miles to Fayette County, Texas. There, in a rural farmhouse not far from where he had killed the Cernicks just weeks before, he found 73-year-old Josephine Convica sleeping in her bed. He killed her with the same pickaxe he had just used on Nomi Dominguez. He left the pickaxe embedded in her skull. In a back room of the farmhouse, investigators later found 2 items they believed Resendiz had deliberately left behind. A local newspaper opened to an article about the manhunt for the railroad killer and a small toy train. Then he moved north. In the small town of Gorham, Illinois, sitting just 100 yards from a set of railroad tracks, lived an 80-year-old man named George Morber. Resendiz broke in and shot him in the back of the head. But as he was inside the house, Morber's daughter, Carolyn Frederick, arrived. She'd come to visit her father. She walked through the door and into the worst thing imaginable. Resendiz beat her to death, and then he sexually assaulted her after she was gone. He covered both bodies with blankets and left. By now, investigators across several states were finally, urgently, connecting the dots. The proximity to train tracks in every single crime. The blunt force. The objects taken from the homes. Jewelry mostly. Small sentimental things he brought back to his wife and mother in Mexico. After each killing, Resendiz would linger in the house for a while. He would eat food from the kitchen. He would lay out the victims' driver's licenses on a surface and look at them carefully, learning who they had been. In June 1999, with murders still coming and communities across the South gripped by fear, the FBI added Angel Maturino Resendiz to the 10 most wanted fugitives list. A reward of $50,000 quickly raised to $125,000. His face was everywhere. Helicopters circled over railway lines. Trains were stopped and searched car by car. And then came the detail that made people genuinely furious. On June 1st, 1999, U.S. Border Patrol agents in New Mexico arrested a man crossing the border. They ran his fingerprints through IDENT, the federal immigration biometric system. His record came up. They processed him. They saw nothing that flagged a murder warrant. because the Texas murder warrant had not been entered into the system in a way the immigration database could actually read. The agencies didn't communicate. The silos held. They sent him back to Mexico. The man was Angel Resendiz. 48 hours later, he crossed back into the United States and killed again. Texas Ranger Drew Carter had been quietly building a relationship with Resendiz's family. His sister, Manuela, had seen the wanted posters and reached out. She was terrified of what her brother had become. Carter made promises: safety in custody, regular family visits, a psychological evaluation, and put it all in writing. On July the 12th, 1999, Carter drove to the El Paso border crossing. Manuela was there, a pastor. A small group of family members stood quietly on the bridge connecting El Paso to Ciudad Juarez, and Angel Maturino Resendiz walked toward them. He was small. People who saw him that day all remarked on it. Wiry, with ropey muscle and dark flat eyes that held nothing, dirty jeans and muddy boots. He walked up to Drew Carter and stuck out his hand. Carter shook it. The most wanted man in America was in custody. At trial in the spring of 2000, his defense argued insanity, and what Resendiz told psychiatrists was not the raving of a man who seemed confused about what he had done. It was something colder and stranger than that. He said he was half man, half angel. He said God had sent him specifically to punish the wicked, that by killing sinners, he was actually releasing their souls to heaven. He had cast himself as judge, jury, and divine executioner. He measured the people he crossed paths with against his own twisted moral code, found them wanting, and killed them. He said he could not be executed because he was eternal, that as a being part angel, he simply could not die. The prosecution pushed back hard. Their argument was straightforward and devastating. A man who covers the bodies, a man who wipes down surfaces, a man who abandons stolen cars in different cities to break the trail. That is not a man lost in delusion. That is a man who knows exactly what he is doing and does not want to be caught. The jury agreed. Guilty. Death. He sat on death row for 6 years. A Houston judge ultimately ruled him mentally fit to be executed. When Resendiz heard the ruling, he said only that he didn't believe in death, that as a person he was eternal, that he would be alive forever. On June 27, 2006, in the execution chamber at the Huntsville unit in Texas, Angel Maturino Resendiz was strapped to a table. Victims' family members watched through one window. His own family watched through another. He looked at both groups. His feet moved nervously under the white sheet. He said he knew he had allowed the devil to rule his life. He asked for forgiveness from the families of the people he had destroyed. He said they had not deserved what he had done to them. And then he said 4 words that, after everything, rang most true. I deserve what I'm getting. Claudia Benton's husband George was in that room. When it was over, he described Angel Resendiz as evil contained in human form, a creature without a soul, no conscience, no sense of remorse, no regard for the sanctity of human life. There is one final detail worth sitting with. After Resendiz surrendered, investigators went to his family in Durango, Mexico. His wife and mother returned jewelry, necklaces, rings, small things taken from the homes of people he had killed. His wife had been wearing some of them. She had not asked where they came from, or perhaps she had, and had learned not to ask again. Some of the jewelry was melted down and was gone forever. The rest was returned to the families of the dead. Henry Louis Wallace killed 11 women, and almost all of them knew his name. They trusted him. They let him in. He strangled them, raped them, stole from them, then showed up at their funerals to cry alongside their families. For 4 years, this Taco Bell worker moved through Charlotte like a ghost, and nobody connected the dots, not until March 9th, 1994, when he killed twice in one day at the same apartment complex. That's when the nightmare finally had a name. Henry Louis Wallace was born on November 4th, 1965, in Barnwell, South Carolina. It's the kind of small town where everyone knows everyone, where secrets don't stay buried long, where reputation is everything. His mother, Lottie Mae Wallace, worked brutal hours at a textile factory, trying to keep food on the table. She raised Henry essentially alone after his father abandoned them, and Lottie Mae was strict. Not the kind of strict that comes from love and boundaries, but the kind that comes from anger and resentment. Henry would later tell psychiatrists that she beat him regularly, that she humiliated him, that she made him wear women's clothing as punishment. He said affection was something he read about in books, but never experienced at home. His sister Yvonne was the golden child. Henry was the problem. But on the surface, Henry seemed fine. He was active in high school, served on student council, was even a cheerleader. He smiled a lot. He graduated in 1983 and briefly attended some college courses before joining the United States Navy in 1985. He served honorably, received good conduct medals, did everything right. He even got married to a woman from Connecticut while he was stationed there. The marriage lasted less than a year. During his time in the Navy, something shifted. Henry discovered crack cocaine. What started as experimentation became dependency, and with that dependency came a need for money. He started burglarizing homes around the Seattle area. In January 1988, he was arrested for breaking into a hardware store. He pled guilty to second-degree burglary that June and was sentenced to 2 years of supervised probation. By the time he was discharged from the Navy in 1988, he was divorced, addicted, and something inside him had gone dark. Henry moved back to Barnwell, and on March 8, 1990, he committed his first murder. Tashanda Bethia was 18 years old, still in high school, her whole life stretching out before her. Henry raped her, strangled her, and dumped her body in a lake. It wasn't found for weeks. When police questioned Henry about her disappearance, he played the concerned friend perfectly. They had nothing to connect him to the crime. He walked away free. He also walked away knowing he could kill and get away with it. Henry moved to Charlotte in the early 1990s. The city was struggling. The crack epidemic had turned certain neighborhoods into war zones. In 1993 alone, there were 129 murders in Charlotte, the deadliest year in the city's history. The police were overwhelmed, understaffed, buried under caseloads they couldn't possibly manage. The homicide unit had maybe 6 to 8 detectives trying to solve dozens of murders. This is important context for understanding what happened next, for understanding how Henry Louis Wallace killed 10 more women over 4 years before anyone realized there was a serial killer in their city. Henry got a job at Taco Bell. He was charming when he wanted to be, with an easy smile and a way of making people feel comfortable. Women liked him. He knew how to listen, how to make them laugh, how to seem trustworthy. And that's what makes this case so deeply disturbing. Henry didn't hunt strangers. He befriended his victims first. They knew him. They trusted him. When he knocked on their doors, they let him in, because why wouldn't they? He was Henry, good old Henry from work. May 27th, 1992, Sharon Nance was a 33-year-old sex worker struggling with addiction. Henry solicited her services, then refused to pay. When she demanded her money, he beat her to death and left her body near railroad tracks. The police found her, filed the report, and the case went cold. Young black woman, sex worker, involved with drugs. The investigation went nowhere. This is a theme that will repeat itself, and it reveals something deeply broken about how these cases were handled. June 14th, 1992. Caroline Love was 20 years old, working at Bojangles, taking college classes, building a future. She was the roommate of Henry's girlfriend. She knew him well, saw him around the apartment all the time. He was familiar, safe. On this night, Henry came to the apartment while his girlfriend was out. Caroline let him in. They smoked crack cocaine together, and then Henry wrapped his hands around her throat. Picture this for a moment. You're in your own home with someone you see almost every day, someone who's never given you reason to fear him, and suddenly you can't breathe. Caroline fought. The autopsy would later show signs of struggle, but Henry was stronger. He strangled her until she stopped moving. Then he raped her lifeless body. Afterward, he wrapped her in blankets and drove her corpse to a wooded area where he dumped her like garbage. Then he went home, crawled into bed with his girlfriend, and went to sleep. The next day, he helped file a missing person report for Caroline. He played the concerned boyfriend, worried about his girlfriend's missing roommate. Caroline's body wouldn't be found for nearly 2 years. For several months, Henry didn't kill again. He worked, he dated, he seemed normal. But something had awakened in him in Caroline's apartment, something he needed to feed. February 19th, 1993. Shauna Denise Hawke was 20 years old, a student at Central Piedmont Community College with dreams of a better life. She worked at Taco Bell, where Henry was her manager. He'd been to her family's home dozens of times. On this night, Henry came to Shauna's home. Her 10-month-old son was there. They talked, they smoked crack, and then Henry strangled her, while her baby was in the apartment. While her child was close enough to hear, but not old enough to understand. Henry raped Shauna's body, then placed her in the bathtub and ransacked the apartment looking for valuables. He found her bank card, somehow figured out her PIN, and over the next few days, he calmly withdrew money from her account. Bank cameras caught him. Police would later review this footage, but they didn't know yet who they were looking for. The baby survived, found days later when Dee Sumter came looking for her daughter. 9 days later, June 22nd, 1993, Audrey Spain was 24 years old, a Taco Bell manager who'd come to Charlotte from a small South Carolina town with dreams of working with computers. She worked alongside Henry. She was a friend. Henry raped her and strangled her in her apartment. Her body was found on June 25th. Another case file, another investigation that went nowhere. August 10th, 1993, Valencia Jumper was 21 years old, a computer science major at Johnson C. Smith University, smart and ambitious with everything to live for. She was friends with Henry's sister Yvonne. She knew Henry through family connections. She trusted him. He came to her apartment, strangled her, raped her, and then did something different. He set her body on fire, trying to make it look like an accidental blaze. The fire didn't destroy all the evidence. Investigators determined she'd been murdered. And then Henry did something that shows just how twisted he was. He attended Valencia's funeral. He stood with her family, cried real tears, and accepted their condolences. Can you imagine that level of depravity? By now, Henry had perfected his method. He knew exactly how much pressure to apply when strangling someone. He knew how long to hold on. He knew what to steal to make it look like a robbery. He knew how to walk out of an apartment calmly, sometimes stopping to wash his hands in the bathroom sink, sometimes taking a moment to look around for anything valuable he might have missed. September 14th, 1993. Michelle Stinson was 20 years old, a college student studying graphic design at Central Piedmont, a single mother of 2 young boys, a friend from Taco Bell. Henry came to her apartment. Her oldest son was there, watching. Michelle let Henry in because she knew him. He was a friend. And in front of her child, Henry strangled her and stabbed her. The medical examiner counted the stab wounds. Michelle fought hard. The scene showed signs of desperate struggle, but she still died. Her son survived the trauma of watching his mother being murdered. Think about that. Think about what that child had to carry for the rest of his life. Now we arrive at March 9th, 1994, the day everything accelerated. the day Henry lost whatever small shred of control he'd been maintaining. Betty Jean Borkham was 24 years old, working at Bojangles, planning to transfer to a location in Sanford to be closer to her fiancé. She worked with Henry's girlfriend Sadie. Henry showed up at her apartment at the Lake Apartments off Albemarle Road. Betty let him in. But something went wrong this time. Betty fought back harder than the others. She broke free once. Imagine that moment of hope, that split second where she thought she might survive, where she was running for the door, for help, for life. Henry caught her. He dragged her back and strangled her until she died. He raped her body, stole her car, and left. Police would later find Henry's palm print on that car. They still didn't connect it to him. But Henry wasn't done for the day. That same day, March 9th, 1994, just hours later, he returned to the same apartment complex. Brandy June Henderson was 18 years old, attending college, the girlfriend of one of Henry's best friends. She had a 10-month-old son named Tyrese. Henry came to her apartment. She was holding Tyrese during the assault. Henry strangled her while she held her baby. When Tyrese started crying, Henry grabbed a towel and tried to suffocate the child. Think about that. He murdered the mother while she held her son, then tried to kill the baby to eliminate a witness. But something made him stop. He gave Tyrese a bottle and a pacifier instead. Then he raped Brandy's body and left. Tyrese survived. He's the only survivor of Henry Louis Wallace's killing spree. March 12th, 1994. 3 days later, Deborah Ann Slaughter was 35 years old, the oldest victim, a woman with a beautiful singing voice who sang in church choirs, a woman remembered for her laugh and her spirit. She was tall and strong, and she fought her attacker with everything she had. Henry stabbed her 38 times, 38 wounds, the rage that took, the fury. He raped her after she died. Then he left her in her apartment. The police were finally starting to see connections. 2 murders on the same day in the same apartment complex. Victims who knew each other. Victims who worked at the same restaurants. But they were still overwhelmed, still understaffed, still drowning in the violence tearing through Charlotte. When they asked for FBI assistance, the FBI declined, saying they didn't believe there was a serial killer. But investigators were piecing things together. The palm print on Betty Borkham's car, the bank surveillance footage showing that distinctive hoop earring after victims' cards were used, the fact that every victim seemed to know the same people, work at the same places. When they interviewed friends and family of the victims, one name kept appearing on every list: Henry Louis Wallace. On March 13th, 1994, the day after Deborah Slaughter's body was discovered, police brought Henry in for questioning. They expected him to deny everything, to demand a lawyer, to play games. Instead, Henry confessed. For 12 to 18 hours, he sat in that interrogation room and walked detectives through every murder, every victim, every detail. He wrote down the names. Police expected 3 or 4. He listed 10 victims from Charlotte. His handwriting was steady. His voice was calm. He remembered dates, names, specific details about each killing. He explained his methods. He described how he chose women who trusted him because trust made them vulnerable. When asked why he killed them, he said he needed money for crack cocaine and that he had unresolved anger toward women. He could be describing his shift at Taco Bell. His tone doesn't change when he talks about raping corpses. He doesn't flinch when describing their faces as they died. This wasn't a man tortured by what he'd done. This was a man explaining a process, a routine he'd perfected over 4 years. The city of Charlotte went into shock. The Charlotte-Mecklenburg Police Department issued a public apology for not identifying the pattern sooner. They admitted they should have connected the cases earlier, that they might have saved lives if they'd acted faster. There were allegations that the police didn't take these cases seriously enough because the victims were young black women, many struggling with poverty and addiction, many living in neighborhoods the police had written off. The department denied racial bias, citing understaffing and the overwhelming murder rate. But the families of the victims knew better. Dee Sumter, Shauna's mother, said it plainly. The victims weren't prominent people with social economic status. They weren't special, and they were black. Henry's trial was delayed for 2 years while attorneys argued over venue, DNA evidence, and jury selection. The trial finally began in September 1996. Prosecutor Marcia Goodnow argued for the death penalty, presenting the overwhelming evidence of Henry's guilt. Defense attorney Isabel Day argued that Henry suffered from mental illness, that his childhood abuse had broken something inside him, that the murders weren't premeditated and therefore shouldn't qualify for first-degree murder charges. The jury didn't buy it. On January 7, 1997, they found Henry Louis Wallace guilty of 9 murders. The killing of Tashanda Bethia in South Carolina and Sharon Nance in Charlotte weren't included in the trial charges, but Henry had confessed to both. On January 29, 1997, Henry was sentenced to death. 9 death sentences, 1 for each victim, to be carried out consecutively. At his sentencing, Henry made a statement to the victims' families. His voice was quiet, almost meek. None of these women, none of your daughters, mothers, sisters, or family members in any way deserved what they got. They did nothing to me that warranted their death. The families sat in silence. Some cried. Some stared at him with hatred burning in their eyes. Dee Sumter would later say she felt nothing when she looked at him. No anger, no sadness, just emptiness. In 1998, Henry married Rebecca Torrias, a former prison nurse, in a ceremony held next to the state's execution chamber at Central Prison in Raleigh. He's filed multiple appeals over the years, claiming his confessions were coerced, that his constitutional rights were violated. The North Carolina Supreme Court upheld his sentences in 2000. The U.S. Supreme Court denied his appeal in 2001. As of today, nearly 30 years later, Henry Louis Wallace is still alive, still sitting on death row. But 11 women are still dead. Tashanda Bethia, Sharon Nance, Caroline Love, Shauna Denise Hawk, Audrey Spain, Valencia Jumper, Michelle Stinson, Vanessa Little Mac, Betty Jean Borkham, Brandy June Henderson, and Deborah Ann Slaughter. 11 women who had names, lives, dreams, families. 11 women who opened their doors to someone they thought was a friend. And that might be the most terrifying part of this entire story. The monster didn't come from outside. He was already there, sitting at the kitchen table, laughing at their jokes. Someone they'd invited into their lives. The danger was never the stranger in the dark alley. It was the familiar face at the door. In 1972, the Stainer family of Merced, California, lost a child. 7-year-old Stephen was snatched off the street by a predator and vanished for 7 years. When he finally came home, the whole country exhaled. The family was called survivors. Stephen was called a hero. There were books, a television miniseries, a story of darkness defeated. What nobody knew, what nobody even thought to ask, was what had been quietly growing inside the older brother, while everyone was looking the other way. This is the story of Cary Stainer. He was born on August 13, 1961, the eldest of 5 children in a working-class family in Merced, California, a small city in the Central Valley, close enough to Yosemite that on clear days you could almost feel the cool air rolling down from the mountains. His father, Delbert, worked hard. His mother, Kay, looked after the children. By all outward appearances, it was an ordinary family in an ordinary town, and Cary was for a time an ordinary child. But even then, even in those earliest years, something wasn't quite right. By the time he was 3 years old, Carrie had been diagnosed with trichotillomania, a compulsive disorder that made him pull out his own hair. It seems like a small detail, but it mattered. Through childhood and into his teenage years, the bald patches it left behind made him a target. Other kids noticed. Other kids always notice. So from the very beginning, Carrie Stainer moved through the world slightly apart from it, watching from a distance, holding something inside. And then, on December 4th, 1972, when Carrie was 11 years old, his 7-year-old brother Stephen disappeared. A man named Kenneth Parnell, a convicted child molester, had approached young Stephen near a church in Merced. He told the boy that his parents had given permission for him to stay with Parnell for a while. Stephen believed him, and just like that, he was gone. The Stainer family was shattered. The kind of grief that a missing child brings is a specific, hollow, unending torment. Because it doesn't resolve, you can't mourn someone who might still be out there. So the family waited, and searched, and prayed. Kerry watched his parents come undone. Years later, investigators and psychiatrists would piece together that during all those years of grief, while the family focused their pain on Stephen, Carrie was quietly developing a fantasy life that was growing darker by the month. He later told investigators he had begun fantasizing about abducting and killing women when he was 7 years old, before Stephen was even taken. That detail is important because it means the darkness inside Carrie Stainer had its own origin, its own private root, something that existed before any family tragedy could be blamed for it. But what came next certainly didn't help. Stephen was held captive by Parnell for 7 years. He was sexually assaulted repeatedly during that time, used, controlled, moved across counties to keep him hidden. When Stephen was 14, Parnell forced him to help lure another child, 5-year-old Timothy White. And in a remarkable act of courage, Stephen took Timothy to the police, identified his captor, and walked back into the world he had been stolen from. He was celebrated as a hero, and he deserved every bit of it. But Carrie, the brother who had stayed behind, the one who had watched his family fracture for almost a decade, received nothing. No spotlight, no cameras, no one asking how he had managed all those years. When Stephen came home, the media came with him. There was a book, there was a TV miniseries, and once again, Carrie Stainer stood in a room full of people and felt completely invisible. He had other struggles too. In 1990, his uncle Jesse was shot dead in his home, a murder that was never solved. In 1991, Carrie tried to kill himself with carbon monoxide. In 1995, he was admitted to a psychiatric hospital following what he described as a nervous breakdown. Then, in 1997, he was arrested for marijuana and methamphetamines, charges that were eventually dropped. And then, in the fall of 1997, something shifted. Carrie Stainer, now 35 years old, took a job as a handyman at Cedar Lodge, a motel tucked just outside the entrance to Yosemite National Park along Highway 140 in El Portal, California. He was given an apartment on the premises. He became, by all accounts, a well-liked and reliable employee. He fixed things. He helped guests. He was calm and friendly and easy to be around. The lodge sat 8 miles from the park entrance, surrounded by pine and granite and the kind of wild, consuming silence that Yosemite generates in the spaces between its famous vistas. He spent his days off wandering by the rivers, swimming, getting high, watching people arrive at the park, families, couples, hikers, tourists from across the world, all of them coming to see something beautiful. Carrie Stainer was watching all of it and planning. He later admitted that he had been fantasizing about murdering women for 30 years by that point. 3 decades of private violence contained behind a normal face, a steady job, a reputation as a nice guy. And by February 1999, he had decided it was time. Carol Sund, a 42-year-old woman from Eureka, California, was settling into her room at Cedar Lodge with her 15-year-old daughter, Julie, and a family friend, 16-year-old Silvina Pelosso, an exchange student from Argentina. They'd spent the day hiking in Yosemite. It was a holiday. A mother and a daughter and a girl from another country sharing an adventure together. They rented some videos from the lodge desk that evening. They were unwinding. Then came a knock at the door. It was the handyman. He told them there was a water leak in the bathroom he needed to check. They let him in. Of course they let him in. He worked there. He had probably fixed things for other guests 100 times. He was that guy, the one you trust, because the environment itself makes him trustworthy. Cary Stayner went into the bathroom, and when he came back out, he was holding a gun. He told them to stay calm, that if they cooperated, he wouldn't hurt them. He bound all 3 women with duct tape. Then he strangled Carol Sund. He sexually assaulted and shot Silvina Pelosso. And then, with the bodies of Carol and Silvina still in the room, he forced 15-year-old Julie into the car. He drove through the night with her, miles and miles, deep into the dark geography of rural California. He later said he drove for hours looking for somewhere to go. Julie Sund was alive in that car for hours after her mother and her friend had been killed. Whatever she felt during those hours, whatever she knew, feared, prayed for, we will never know. He drove her to a remote area near Lake Don Pedro. He sexually assaulted her. Then he cut her throat and left her body in the dirt near a creek. He put Carol and Silvina's bodies in the trunk of the rental car, drove it to a secluded stretch of road near Long Barn, California, and set it on fire. Before he left, he took Carol's wallet. He would later drive to Modesto, an hour away, and drop it in the street to redirect the investigation. He returned to work at Cedar Lodge. When the 3 women were reported missing, police began questioning lodge employees. They spoke to Stayner. He was cooperative, clean-cut, calm. He told investigators a story about his brother Stephen, expressing sympathy, appearing engaged and helpful. He was so unremarkable as a suspect that when the FBI arrived to gather forensic evidence from the rooms, Cary Stayner was the man opening the doors for them. In March, a hiker found the burned-out rental car. When investigators opened the trunk, they found the charred, almost unrecognizable remains of Carol Sund and Silvina Pelosso. And then, in late March, the FBI received an anonymous letter, a taunting note with a crude map showing where Julie's body could be found. They followed it, and they found her. The note had been written by Cary Stayner. He sent it not out of remorse. He sent it, investigators believe, because he wanted the attention, because he wanted to feel the weight of what he had done pressing against the world, because some part of him needed to be witnessed. The investigation intensified. A task force was assembled spanning multiple counties and FBI field offices. They pursued dozens of leads. They arrested and publicly named suspects, 2 brothers with criminal records who had been in the area. For weeks, the case seemed to be breaking open. Then the charges were quietly dropped. The brothers were cleared. The FBI announced in June that they believed the responsible parties were likely already in custody. They were wrong. Cary Stayner was still at Cedar Lodge, still working, still watching the people coming and going through those mountain roads, still carrying a backpack that a woman who had known him during that period later described as something he kept on him the way other people carry a wallet. She didn't know what was in it then. She found out later. A gun, duct tape, a knife. She called it his murder kit. She had been around him with that kit more times than she could count. And on July 21st, 1999, he used it again. Joey Ruth Armstrong was 26 years old, a naturalist working for the Yosemite Institute. She ran environmental education programs for children visiting the park. She was passionate. She was young. And on the evening of July 21st, she was packing for a trip to meet friends. She was staying in a small cabin in Foresta, a cluster of employee housing deep inside the park. She had plans, a whole life pulling her forward. Stayner had spotted her earlier while passing through the area, and he decided. He approached her cabin with his gun. He forced her inside, bound her hands and mouth with duct tape, put her in his truck and began to drive. And then, and this detail is both devastating and extraordinary, Joy Armstrong, her hands bound, threw herself through the open window of that moving vehicle. She hit the ground and ran. She ran through the dark towards the trees, fighting for her life with everything she had. He caught her. He dragged her into the trees and he killed her. He decapitated her, leaving her body beside a stream, her head placed in the water that local residents used for drinking. It was a detail so deliberately brutal that some investigators initially couldn't believe a single person had done it. The next morning, a friend who couldn't reach her called for help. Rangers found her body. By then, a witness had already reported seeing a pale blue 1972 International Scout parked near Armstrong's cabin the evening before. It was a distinctive vehicle. People who knew the area knew whose it was. It was Cary Stayner's. The FBI went to find him. They detained him, searched his truck, took his backpack. They found evidence linking him to Armstrong's murder. They warned him not to leave town. And then, inexplicably, due to a clerical error, he was released overnight. By morning, he was gone. He had gone back to the lodge, tried quickly to sell some of his belongings, then vanished north. He ended up at Laguna del Sol, a nudist resort outside Sacramento, more than 3 hours away, where he was living in a tent. The FBI found him on July 24th. They brought him in for questioning at their Sacramento field office. Special Agent Jeffrey Rinnick conducted the interview. Rinnick was experienced, methodical, deeply human in his approach, the kind of investigator who understood that the way you listened sometimes determined what you heard. He and Stayner talked for hours before anything significant was said, just two men in a room, feeling each other out. And then Stayner began to talk. He confessed first to the murder of Joy Armstrong, and then, over the next 6 hours, he confessed to everything. Carol Sund, Silvina Pelosso, Julie Sund. He described each killing in detail, specific, composed, unflinching. He admitted to 30 years of violent fantasy. He described his methods. He accounted for every hour of every night. But before he would say any of it on the record, Stayner made 3 requests. He wanted his family to receive the reward money that had been posted during the investigation. He wanted to be placed in a federal facility close to home, and he wanted access to child pornography. Agent Rinnick told him to pick one. Stayner chose the pornography over the money for his family, over proximity to the people who had raised him. That single choice, of all the things he could have prioritized in his final moments of leverage, said something that no psychiatrist ever needed to elaborate on. It clarified something. It finished the picture. His confession led investigators back through the case in reverse, through every lie, every misdirection, every false clue he had planted. The wallet dropped in Modesto, the anonymous letter with the map, the way he had stood calm and open-faced while FBI agents moved through the rooms where he had killed 3 people and asked him questions he already knew the answers to. He also told investigators something that shook Agent Rinnick to his core, that on 3 separate occasions, he had planned to kill a woman who lived near Cedar Lodge and her 2 young daughters, a woman he had been in a relationship with, girls he had brought beanie babies for, drawn pictures for, given rides to in his truck, girls who had adored him. He had planned 3 times to murder them and stopped, for reasons he couldn't fully articulate. The FBI informed the woman privately. She later said she couldn't believe what she was hearing. She said her daughters had loved him. She said he was a happy part of their lives, right up until the moment he wasn't. In 2001, Stayner pleaded guilty to the murder of Joy Armstrong in federal court and was sentenced to life in prison. In 2002, he was tried for the murders of the Sund family and Silvina Pelosso. His lawyers argued mental illness, childhood trauma, the devastation of his brother's kidnapping. A psychiatrist testified that while Stayner unquestionably had a disturbed childhood, the kidnapping of Stephen alone could not account for what he became. Whatever had grown inside Cary Stayner had its own roots, its own dark logic, its own history that predated everything. The jury convicted him on all 3 counts. The judge sentenced him to death 3 times. He sits on death row at San Quentin State Prison today. California has not executed anyone since 2006. And in 2019, Governor Gavin Newsom imposed a moratorium on capital punishment in the state. Cary Stayner is in his mid-60s. He wakes in a cell roughly the size of a king bed. He has access to 10 hours of outdoor exercise per week. Beyond that, attorneys, isolation and time. His brother Stephen, the one whose story was turned into books and television, the one who came home a hero, died in a motorcycle accident in 1989, aged just 24. He never knew what his older brother was carrying. He never knew what was waiting in the mind of the boy who had wished on a star for him to come home. One childhood friend of Cary's said something during the investigation that has stayed with people ever since. He said that when Stephen was taken, Cary was deeply upset, that Cary used to go outside at night and wish on stars, begging for his brother to come home. The creeping shadow of a family torn open and never quite put back together. These things matter, and they are real, but they are not the whole story, because investigators believe Stayner may have additional victims, disappearances from the surrounding region dating back to the early 1980s, cases that have never been resolved, including a woman whose remains were identified decades later in Yosemite itself, a woman Stayner is known to have had a connection to. The full shape of what Cary Stayner did may never be known. He moved through the world as someone entirely unremarkable, entirely trustworthy, entirely safe for 37 years, and the entire time something behind his eyes was somewhere else entirely. Between February 1926 and June 1927, a darkness crossed 2 countries and butchered at least 22 people. Women strangled until cords embedded in their flesh. A 14-year-old girl mutilated so severely that some officers couldn't bring themselves to enter the room. Bodies stuffed in trunks, hidden behind furnaces, crammed into bathroom lavatories, while the killer moved like smoke from California to Canada, leaving a trail of corpses that police couldn't connect until it was far too late. This is the story of Earl Leonard Nelson, America's first serial sex killer, the man they called the Gorilla Killer, the Dark Strangler. And what made him truly terrifying wasn't just what he did, it was how easily he made people trust him before he destroyed them. May 12, 1897. Earl Leonard Ferrol enters a world already poisoned. His mother Frances and father James are dying, syphilis eating through their bodies, liquefying their brains. Frances dies when Earl is 9 months old. James follows 6 months later. The boy, not even 2, goes to his grandmother Jenny Nelson, a Pentecostal whose God is made of fire and judgment. She raises him in a house where pleasure is sin, where the book of Revelation is read nightly, where apocalyptic visions replace bedtime stories. The child is strange from the beginning, withdrawn, morbid. He talks to people who aren't there, quotes scripture about beasts and whores, watches his cousin Rachel undress through cracks in doors. At 7, he's expelled from school for violent behavior that terrifies other children. Then comes the moment everything breaks. Age 10, Earl's showing off on a bicycle, racing down the street to impress neighborhood kids. He misjudges the timing and rides directly into the path of a streetcar. The impact launches him through the air. His skull cracks against pavement with a sound witnesses hear blocks away. Blood erupts from a hole in his temple, pouring onto the street. Children scatter, screaming. Doctors find a fractured skull, a visible dent that will never heal. They don't expect him to survive. For 6 days, Earl hovers in a coma, brain swelling against shattered bone. When he wakes, something fundamental has died. The quiet boy is gone. What emerges is manic, unpredictable, damaged. Blinding migraines make him claw at his skull and scream. His memory fractures. He walks on his hands through the house, lifts heavy chairs with his teeth, leaves for school in clean clothes, returns in filthy rags torn from homeless men. The voyeurism intensifies. The religious obsession becomes consuming. He quotes passages about the whore of Babylon compulsively, hands trembling, eyes wild. By puberty, he's haunting Barbary Coast brothels. At 18, he's in San Quentin for burglary. After release, the pattern repeats: theft, jail, escape. In 1921, he poses as a plumber to enter a home on Pacific Avenue. Inside, he finds 12-year-old Mary Summers alone. He tries to rape her. She screams. Her brother comes running. Nelson flees, but he's caught. Committed to Napa State Hospital for the insane. Doctors document visions, auditory hallucinations, paranoid delusions about poison. But Napa's security is a joke. Nelson walks out, returns, escapes again. In March 1925, they discharge him in absentia, giving up. A brain-damaged sexual predator with psychotic episodes is released into the world unsupervised. What happens next is inevitable. The first time happens on a cold February day in 1926. Clara Newman, 60, runs a boarding house on Pierce Street, San Francisco. She's wealthy, respected, the kind of woman who takes pride in keeping a clean establishment. When she puts up her room for rent sign, she has no idea she's just painted a target on her back. The man who arrives at her door is everything she'd hoped for in a tenant. Well-dressed, polite. He carries a worn Bible tucked under his arm and introduces himself as Roger Wilson. She shows him around, pleased with his manners, his soft-spoken demeanor. An hour later, he's gone. What Clara's neighbors don't see is her body cooling in a vacant apartment, strangled, violated after death, jewelry stolen. Police call it robbery gone wrong, just bad luck. They have no idea they're looking at victim number 1. Nelson rides the train to San Jose. 2 weeks have passed, but the kill is still fresh in his mind. Replaying, feeding something dark and hungry inside him. The migraines that have plagued him since that streetcar shattered his skull are getting worse. But they quiet during the act. During the killing, that's when his mind goes silent. Laura Beale, 63, makes the mistake of advertising a room. Nelson, calling himself Roger Wilson again, arrives with his Bible. The silken cord he uses winds so tight around her neck, it embeds in flesh, becomes part of her. She's the second. The pattern solidifies. San Francisco, San Jose, Santa Barbara, Oakland. Nelson moves like smoke between cities, his damaged brain cycling between psychotic episodes and terrifying clarity. Between kills, he's a devout man studying scripture, quoting Revelation, seeing prophetic visions in the faces of strangers. During kills, he's something else entirely, something that enjoys the power, the control, the way life drains from their eyes when he squeezes. In August, something shifts. Stephen Nisbet comes home to an empty house in Oakland, his wife Mary missing. He searches with neighbors, knowing something's wrong, feeling it in his gut. They find her crammed in the bathroom lavatory, a kitchen dish towel knotted around her throat. But it's worse than strangulation. Her head's been smashed against bathroom tiles with such savage violence her teeth scatter across the floor, blood spattering every surface. This is different, more brutal, more personal. Nelson's control is slipping. The rage building inside him needs more than strangulation now. It needs destruction. Police arrest Stephen Nisbet, hold him 2 days. By the time they realize he's innocent, the real killer's already 3 states away, the migraines subsiding. The voice is quiet again, at least for now. Isabel Gallegos in Stockton, Elmer Wells in San Francisco. Witnesses start describing the same figure, stocky, dark, unusually long arms, massive hands that look like they could crush windpipes effortlessly. Gorilla proportions. The newspapers seize on it, the gorilla killer, the dark strangler stalking California's landladies. October, Portland. Nelson's method changes and it reveals something deeper about the fractured mind operating behind those dead eyes. Beata Withers, 35, divorced, trying to make ends meet by running a boarding house. Her 15-year-old son finds her, not under a bed this time, inside a steamer trunk in the attic, her body stuffed beneath clothing like she's cargo being shipped somewhere. The next day, Virginia Grant is discovered behind a furnace in a vacant property. Then, Mabel Fluke in an attic crawl space. 3 murders in 3 days. The hiding places are more elaborate now, more thought out. Nelson's trying to conceal them, delay discovery, which means some part of him knows what he's doing is wrong. But that knowledge doesn't stop him, can't stop him. The compulsion is too strong, the temporary relief from his fractured mind too seductive. Portland police issue warnings. A coroner's jury actually debates whether Beata Withers killed herself. Suicide. In a trunk. In an attic. The incompetence would be laughable if it wasn't so tragic. Nelson's already killing again. He drifts south to Los Angeles. Marion Corcoran returns to San Francisco. Anna Edmonds shoved under a bed. Then Seattle, where wealthy widow Florence Monks becomes another victim. Something strange happens after Monks dies. Nelson takes her jewelry, pawns some of it, but keeps other pieces. Returns to a Portland boarding house using the name Adrian Harris. Before leaving for Vancouver, he gifts jewelry to his landlady and another female boarder. Pieces later confirmed as Florence Monks' property. The women had accepted gifts from a corpse, touched items still warm from a dead woman's skin, and they never knew. There's something deeply wrong about this behavior, something that goes beyond theft. He's creating connections with these women, false intimacy, even as he carries reminders of his victims. Thanksgiving, 1926. Blanche Myers is eating lunch with a male friend when Nelson knocks. Despite newspapers screaming warnings about the Dark Strangler, she trusts the polite man with the Bible and the lumberjack story. $4 for a room seems reasonable. She returns to her lunch, pleased with herself. Hours later, they find her garroted underneath the bed she'd just rented, her diamond engagement ring and $8.50 gone. This time, police lift fingerprints from her bedpost, the first solid forensic evidence. But Nelson's already gone, riding trains east, the voices in his head alternating between scripture and screaming. By December, he's killed 14 women in 10 months. The frequency is accelerating. Almira Berard in Council Bluffs, Bonnie Pace in Kansas City. Then 1927 arrives, and something inside Nelson completely unravels. The control, the pattern, the careful planning. It all starts breaking down. Philadelphia, Buffalo, Detroit, where on June 1st he kills 2 women in the same building. Fannie Mae and Maureen Atorthy, both strangled. The cord killing Fannie was ripped from an electric lamp while current still flowed through it. The knife found at the scene bears burn marks, a nicked blade from electricity. He's not thinking clearly anymore, not planning, just killing. Building owner Leonard Sink discovers both corpses when he arrives to collect rent. He's killing once every 3 weeks now, sometimes faster. At his peak, he'll murder 5 women in just 10 days. The migraines are constant, the hallucinations bleeding into reality. Police across multiple states are finally starting to connect the dots, but Nelson moves too fast, rides too many trains, uses too many names. By the time telegrams arrive in one city, he's already butchering someone in another. Then he crosses into Canada. His final fatal mistake. June 8th, 1927, Winnipeg. Nelson hitchhikes into city. First stop, second-hand clothing store. Trades clothes for workers' gear and $1. Goes to Catherine Hill's boarding house on Smith Street. Rents a room as Mr. Woodcoats. Pays $1 down. Promises 3 more Friday. Catherine thinks he's a nice Christian man. That day he encounters Lola Cowan, 14. Father recovering from pneumonia. Family desperate, so Lola sells paper flowers door to door. Nobody witnesses their meeting, but Nelson convinces this child to return to his room. What happens next defies comprehension. Lola Cowan's strangled to death, then mutilates her body with grotesque, extreme savagery. When police discover her days later decomposing under the bed, seasoned officers stumble out vomiting, unable to process what they've seen. The mutilation is that severe, that depraved. It's one of only 3 victims Nelson mutilates to this degree. What drove him to this particular brutality with this particular child, we'll never know. Next day, June 10th, Nelson spots another room for rent sign. Emily Patterson's home. She's alone, cleaning. Nelson offers repairs in exchange for lodging. New to Winnipeg, struggling financially, it seems reasonable. Neighbors watch him fix the screen door. Helpful, harmless. Once certain she's alone, he attacks. Emily fights with everything she has, claws his face bloody, screams until her voice shreds. But Nelson's stronger. Strangles her with cord, rapes her, bludgeons her skull with a claw hammer, steals her husband's suit, her wedding ring, the family Bible, stuffs her naked, brutalized body under the bed, walks out. That evening, William Patterson comes home. Empty house. He searches, calls her name, questions neighbors. Nobody's seen Emily. Darkness falls. He kneels beside their bed, praying for her safe return. Notices something. Pulls into view what remains of his wife. Purple, bloated, violated, murdered while he was away. Winnipeg detonates. 2 murders in 2 days, and police finally realize they're hunting the same killer. 4,000 people mob the streets outside police headquarters, desperate to glimpse the monster when he's caught. But Nelson's already running. Gets a shave and haircut at a local barbershop. The barber, Nicholas Tabor, notices dried blood crusted in Nelson's scalp. Deep scratch marks across his face. When Tabor asks about them, Nelson becomes agitated, demands the barber not touch them. The next day, police begin tracing everything. They talk to the jeweler, the clothing dealer, the barber. All 3 describe the same man. Dark complexion, stocky build, fresh scratches, dried blood in his hair. Descriptions flood police stations across the region. June 16, Killarney, Manitoba. Local constables spot a man matching the description. They approach him carefully. He's calm, cooperative, gives his name as Virgil Wilson, says he's just a farmer passing through. He's so calm, so reasonable, that the constables almost believe they've got the wrong man. But they take him to the local jail anyway, just to be safe. That evening, Virgil Wilson escapes. He slips out into darkness and flees on foot, then makes a fatal error. He hops a freight train heading south, not knowing the train is carrying Winnipeg police officers returning from the search. The next morning, a constable from Crystal City spots him near a grain elevator and arrests him again. This time, they bring him to Rupert Street Police Station in Winnipeg. Inside, police photograph him, fingerprint him, measure him, prepare him for identification lineups. They send his photos and fingerprints to police departments across America. San Francisco sends back Nelson's prints from his previous arrests. Perfect match. His fingerprints match those lifted from multiple crime scenes. His teeth match bite marks found on victims' bodies. The scratches on his face match Emily Patterson's desperate fight for life. The blood in his hair is from where she tore it out while dying. They ask him to write down his name and birth date. He writes, Earl Nelson, born San Francisco, 1897. They have him. Even caught, forensically linked to dozens of murders across 2 countries, Nelson denies everything. In an interview with the Manitoba Free Press, he states flatly, I'm charged with 2 murders, but I'm not the one who done it. During the trial, a jail guard notes something disturbing. Nelson has become obsessed with a particular passage from Proverbs, reading it over and over. My son, give me thine heart, and let thine eyes observe my ways. For a whore is a deep ditch, and a strange woman is a narrow pit. Even in captivity, even facing the gallows, he's still justifying himself through scripture. The jury deliberates for 48 minutes. They return with a guilty verdict. Judge Andrew Dysart sentences Earl Leonard Nelson to death by hanging. Nelson stares blankly at the judge, his face showing neither understanding nor concern. In the weeks following his conviction, he becomes increasingly agitated. The day before his execution, he meets with families of 2 of his victims, including Lola Cowan's mother. He still refuses to admit anything, still claims this is all a horrible mistake. January 13th, 1928, Friday the 13th, Vaughan Street Jail, Winnipeg. Earl Leonard Nelson, 30 years old, walks 13 steps to the gallows. He spent 2 months on death row. The noose is placed around his neck, the rope carefully measured to ensure his death will be quick, that his neck will break cleanly instead of leaving him to slowly strangle. The executioner asks if he has any last words. Nelson looks out at the assembled witnesses, at the police officers, at the families of victims who've come to see justice done. He says, "I forgive those who have wronged me." Not, "I'm sorry," no confession, no acknowledgement of the 22 confirmed murders. The trapdoor opens. Nelson drops. But something goes wrong with the drop distance. His neck doesn't break cleanly the way it should. For 11 agonizing minutes he struggles at the end of the rope, slowly suffocating, his body twitching and convulsing as death takes its time claiming him. The gorilla killer, the Dark Strangler, America's first serial sex killer. 22 confirmed dead, at least 5 more possibly attributed to him. A record that would stand for decades until worse monsters emerged from the shadows. The Indianapolis Police Department received a call on June 3, 1996, that would crack open one of the most disturbing cases in Indiana history. But what they found wasn't a fresh crime scene. It was a burial ground that had been hiding in plain sight for years, right under the noses of families who had driven past it thousands of times. And the man who created it had been living a double life so convincing, so meticulously crafted, that even his own wife had no idea she'd been sleeping next to a predator. Fox Hollow Farm, an 18-acre estate in the affluent Westfield suburb, complete with a sprawling manor house, an indoor pool, and acres of wooded property. The kind of place where successful families lived the American dream. But when investigators began digging through those woods, they discovered something that would haunt them for the rest of their careers. Scattered among the leaves and soil were the remains of at least 11 men. The man who owned Fox Hollow Farm was named Herbert Richard Baumeister, and by the time police came knocking, he was already gone. What he left behind was a trail of death so extensive that investigators believe they may never know the true body count. Herb Baumeister was born on April 7, 1947, in Indianapolis, Indiana, to Herbert Sr. and Elizabeth Baumeister. His father worked as an anesthesiologist, a respected professional who provided well for his wife and 4 children. But inside the Baumeister household, things were far from normal. From an early age, Herb exhibited behaviors that should have raised serious red flags. When he was 6 years old, he discovered a dead crow in his backyard. Most children would have been disturbed or scared. Herb was fascinated. He picked up the bird, carried it around, and eventually placed it on his teacher's desk at school. When asked why, he had no real answer. As Herb grew older, the strange behaviors intensified. He developed an obsession with dead animals, frequently bringing home roadkill to dissect and examine. His mother later recalled finding animal remains hidden in various places around their home. He urinated on his teacher's desk on one occasion, an act of defiance that seemed to come from nowhere. His parents took him to see a psychiatrist who diagnosed him with schizophrenia and recommended treatment. But in the 1950s and early 1960s, the stigma surrounding psychiatric treatment was immense. The Baumeister's didn't follow through with any meaningful long-term care. Herb's teenage years were marked by social isolation. He was awkward, unable to connect with his peers. He went through the motions of normal adolescent life, but there was always something off about him that other kids could sense. He was like an actor playing the role of a normal teenager, but never quite nailing the performance. After barely graduating high school, Herb enrolled at Indiana University. He dropped out after one semester. He tried again at Butler University, but couldn't maintain focus. For several years, he drifted, working odd jobs, still living with his parents. And then, in 1971, something unexpected happened. He met Juliana Saiter. Juliana was a kind, trusting woman who worked as a high school teacher. When she met Herb, she saw a man who was a bit odd, certainly, but also intelligent and ambitious. They married in 1971. Herb was 24 years old. The couple had 3 children together. Herb managed to hold down a steady job, eventually working his way up in the business world, but his employment history was rocky. He was fired from the Bureau of Motor Vehicles for urinating on a letter addressed to the Indiana governor. Despite these setbacks, Herb found his footing in the retail world. In 1988, he and his wife opened a thrift store called Save-A-Lot in Indianapolis. The store was surprisingly successful, eventually expanding to multiple locations. To the outside world, Herb Baumeister had finally made something of himself. He even moved his growing family to that estate in Westfield, Fox Hollow Farm, in 1991. They paid nearly $1 million for the property. But behind this carefully constructed facade, Herb was living an entirely different life. Throughout his marriage, Herb had been hiding his sexuality. He was gay, or at the very least bisexual, in an era and environment where such an identity could destroy everything he'd built. The pressure of maintaining this secret, combined with whatever darker urges had been brewing inside him since childhood, created a psychological pressure cooker. And in the early 1990s, that pressure found an outlet. Indianapolis had a vibrant gay community that congregated in certain bars. Herb began frequenting these spaces, often when his wife was away visiting family with the children. He would introduce himself as Brian Smart, a pseudonym that allowed him to move through these social circles without risking his reputation or family life. Many serial killers create alternate identities, not because they have dissociative identity disorder, but because compartmentalization allows them to reconcile their criminal behavior with their public life. By being Brian Smart, Herb could separate his violent urges from his identity as Herbert Baumeister, husband and father. Herb's hunting ground was Indianapolis's gay community, specifically young men who were often marginalized and less likely to be immediately missed. His victims were typically in their 20s and 30s, men looking for connection. Herb would approach them in bars, charming, seemingly interested in a genuine connection. He'd offer them a drink, conversation, and eventually an invitation back to his estate. The promise of seeing a mansion in the wealthy suburbs must have seemed exciting to some of these men. Here was this successful businessman, interested in them, inviting them into his world. They had no idea they were stepping into a trap. Once at Fox Hollow Farm, Herb's pattern became horrifically clear. He would suggest using the pool. Drinking would continue. At some point, Herb would introduce an element of erotic asphyxiation, choking as a sexual act, which would allow him to get his hands around his victim's throat without immediately alarming them. But Herb didn't stop. He would continue choking until the man lost consciousness, and then he would keep going until they were dead. Strangulation requires sustained physical contact, face-to-face proximity, and several minutes of continuous effort. For someone like Herb Baumeister, the control, the power, the gradual extinguishing of another human life while he held them in his hands, This was what satisfied whatever dark need drove him. After his victims were dead, Herb faced the practical problem of disposal. He would drag or carry the bodies into the woods, dig shallow graves, or simply scatter remains among the trees, confident that the property was large enough and private enough that no one would stumble across what he'd hidden. Sometimes he would dismember the bodies. Other times, he would simply bury them whole. For years this went on. Men disappeared from Indianapolis's gay community with disturbing regularity, but because many of them were estranged from their families or living transient lifestyles, their disappearances didn't trigger intensive investigations. This is a dark reality about serial killers. Many of them are able to operate for extended periods because they target vulnerable populations that society pays less attention to. But in 1994, Herb made a mistake that would eventually lead to his downfall. A man named Tony Harris survived an encounter with Herb. Tony had met him in a bar, gone back to Fox Hollow Farm, and during what started as consensual activity, Herb had begun choking him. Tony fought back, managed to escape, and reported the incident to police. But Tony didn't know Herb's real name. He only knew him as Brian. Tony's boyfriend, a man named Doug Freeman, was more persistent. He was convinced that the police weren't taking the case seriously. So Doug started doing his own investigation. He began visiting gay bars in Indianapolis, showing people a sketch of Brian, asking if anyone recognized him. Months passed, and then Doug caught a break. He spotted Herb in a bar and managed to follow him to a parking lot, where he wrote down the license plate number. He took this information to the police, and they traced it back to Herbert Baumeister of Fox Hollow Farm. But even with this information, the police were in a difficult position. Herb was a respected businessman with no criminal record. To get a search warrant for his property, they needed Herb's wife to cooperate. In 1995, Detective Mary Wilson from the Indianapolis Police Department approached Juliana Baumeister. She asked if police could search the property for evidence connected to missing persons cases. Juliana refused, not because she knew what her husband had done, but because she was in denial, protecting the life she'd built. She couldn't conceive that Herb was capable of what they were suggesting. But Juliana had noticed things, strange things. Herb's behavior had become increasingly erratic. He would disappear for days at a time. Money was going missing from their business. And on a few occasions, she'd found bones on their property, bones that Herb dismissed as animal remains. In 1996, Juliana finally reached her breaking point. She filed for divorce and moved out of Fox Hollow Farm with the children. And once she was away from Herb's influence, she agreed to let police search the property. What they found was worse than anyone had imagined. The initial search revealed skeletal remains and bone fragments scattered across multiple locations. By the time they finished, they had recovered over 5,000 bone fragments, representing at least 11 individual victims, though the true number could be higher. Many of the remains were too degraded for identification. But investigators were able to identify some of the victims through dental records. They included Roger Goodlett, Richard Hamilton, Manuel Resendez, Michael Riley, and others. Men who had been reported missing from the Indianapolis area. Men whose families had been waiting years for answers. When police came to arrest Herb Baumeister, he was gone. He'd gotten word that investigators were searching his property, and he'd fled. His marriage was over. His business was failing. His carefully constructed double life was collapsing, and he knew exactly what police were finding in his woods. Herb drove north, eventually crossing into Canada. For days, he wandered, moving from place to place. On July 3rd, 1996, he checked into a campground in Pinery Provincial Park in Ontario. Inside his vehicle, police later found a 45-page suicide note. In it, Herb didn't confess to the murders. He didn't express remorse for the men he'd killed. Instead, he rambled about his failed marriage, his business problems, his disappointments. He blamed Juliana for ruining his life, claimed he was a victim of circumstances. Even at the end, Herb Baumeister couldn't take responsibility for what he'd done. On July 3rd, 1996, Herb Baumeister placed a .357 Magnum revolver in his mouth and pulled the trigger. He was found dead inside his vehicle the next morning. He was 49 years old. His suicide denied the victims' families any sense of justice. There would be no trial, no opportunity for him to face his accusers. But what investigators did discover suggests that the 11 victims found at Fox Hollow Farm were just the beginning. Police found evidence linking Herb to a series of unsolved murders along Interstate 70 through Ohio and Indiana during the 1980s and early 1990s. Bodies had been discovered in rural areas near highway rest stops. Men who had been strangled and dumped, much like Herb's later victims. The timeline matched periods when Herb had been traveling for business. But without Herb alive to confirm or deny it, these cases remain officially unsolved. Fox Hollow Farm itself has become a dark landmark in Indiana. The property has changed hands several times since 1996, with each owner fully aware of its history. Some have reported paranormal activity, voices in the woods, shadows moving between trees. But the estate remains a place where evil lived comfortably for years, hidden behind manicured lawns and picket fences. For the families of Herb's victims, the discovery brought some closure, but also new pain. After years of not knowing, they finally had answers. But those answers confirmed their worst fears. Their loved ones hadn't simply disappeared. They'd been murdered, their bodies scattered in the woods by a man who felt nothing for them. Today, Herbert Baumeister is estimated to have killed between 11 and 25 men, possibly more. The exact number will never be known because Herb took those secrets with him to his grave. Because that's the truly terrifying thing about Herb Baumeister. He wasn't an obviously disturbed outsider. He was a husband, a father, a successful businessman. People worked for him, socialized with him, trusted him. His children loved him. His wife lived with him for 25 years and never knew what he was capable of. He attended parent-teacher conferences and ran a business and maintained an 18-acre estate, all while systematically hunting and killing men who trusted him enough to accept an invitation to his home. When investigators searched through Herb's belongings after his death, they found detailed records of his business transactions, family photos, normal everyday documentation of a normal everyday life. But they also found gaps, periods of time unaccounted for, business trips with vague itineraries, hundreds of miles driven with no clear destination. Each gap represents a potential victim, another family that might never get closure. Herbert Richard Baumeister died by his own hand on July 3rd, 1996, escaping justice, escaping accountability, escaping the reckoning he deserved.